Welcome back to the Fierce Freedom Podcast. I'm Kat Morgan,
I'm Mark Halverson.
and it's really good to be here with you, Mark.
Been a while.
It has been a little while, and we were talking about how you as a radio host, you generously donate your time and talents to this podcast and improve, elevate it so much. And you have been doing that for 40 years.
Well, I was
Pretty
thinking after the
exciting.
last time you talked about, oh, Mark's done radio for over 30 years. And I'm like, yeah. So I started at 17 in high school. I just turned 60. So,
Wow.
yeah.
So the math on that is
Mhm.
about 40.
Figure it out. Yeah.
So I said before we recorded, and I want to say it now,
Yeah.
it's a middle-aged career.
It's a middle-aged career. Yes. Yes.
Just be careful it doesn't want to,
My
buy a
career,
Corvette or something.
my career's over there.
Look out.
Okay.
Anyway, well, we are really blessed today to be joined by Audrey Walters Moore, who is doing some incredible work. And Audrey, we actually got connected through an acquaintance all of us have, which is Diane Bryant, which is very cool. She's actually has served as the spiritual director at Fierce Freedom, and she will meet with our staff and just do check-ins and everything. And I know you know her, Mark, and she's just a fantastic person. And I love that because of that, we sort of got connected. So yeah. How do you know Diane, Audrey?
Yeah, Diane has been and her husband have been connecting with Lift Up the Vulnerable for many years. So I think they have a passion and a compassion for serving locally and globally. And love is one of the ways that they help connect in that.
Okay. Yes, that's awesome. And so I really want to introduce you as well. So Audrey is the CEO at Lift Up the Vulnerable, which is, as you mentioned, or LUV, which I really love that short acronym there. Audrey has dedicated her life to shedding light on human trafficking and the injustices taking place in our world, especially in conflict zones. She attended the University of Delaware, where she received a Bachelor of Science in Education. After graduation, she moved to Belgium with the Young Adult Service Corps to work with international students and refugees throughout Western and Eastern Europe. While living in Europe, she learned of the horrors of human trafficking firsthand when a children's home she'd been volunteering at was exposed as a front for prostitution.
And at the time, she was a charter board member for the organization, which helped to close down the home in an effort to rescue vulnerable children before experiencing the trauma of trafficking. Audrey's worked since 2005 to support the foundation and expansion of the only indigenously directed anti-trafficking network that today spans Sudan and South Sudan. In 2018, Audrey became CEO of Lift Up the Vulnerable and leads the mission of preventing trafficking and empowering change makers in war-torn communities. Welcome, Audrey.
Yes, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And I was lucky enough to, have a conversation with you a few weeks ago and learn a little bit more. And I was like, oh, we have to have you on the podcast because, human trafficking is something that spans the globe. I know that Fierce Freedom is focused on really shining light, I think, on the domestic side of trafficking. But something we always want to be lifting up and elevating are the voices of people like you that are sharing stories about what does this look like in those conflict zones and war-torn areas. And really, I was so struck by our conversation and just I know that there's vulnerabilities that exist everywhere, but just I would say, amalgamation and the accumulation of those vulnerabilities in some of these areas, like the poverty and everything you'll talk about. But yeah, so I just want to say thank you so much for the work that you do with LUV. And I would love for you to also share, we talked a little bit about your bio, but how did you kind of get into this work and how did your professional background lead to you being in the role that you're in now?
Yeah, that's great. I think all journeys, great or interesting or just strange, don't make much sense in the living of it, but then they unfold and you see how God's hand was in different stages of your life. For example, I had thought when I was younger that I wanted to be a teacher, and I had a vision that a teacher was what I should do. I pursued that in university. My very last semester, I knew that this was in no way, shape, or form for me because second graders that I was student teaching with were eating me alive. And as they do when they smell blood.
Honestly.
But so that opened a door for me to take a next step of, I had heard that my former campus minister was now the senior pastor at a church in Belgium, and there was an opening for a youth ministry position. I jumped on it, I got it, served in Belgium, and took that next step. And then when I was in Belgium, it's when I learned about human trafficking, and just taking that next step. I don't know if you are, both of you are familiar with Thomas Merton, but he has a prayer that I think about so often, and I keep it close to my computer, but where he says, my Lord God, I have no idea where I'm going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so, but I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope that I have that desire in all the things that I do. And in just taking that right next step has led me on this strange journey to places that I wouldn't have chosen to go, or be with people that I may not have, even dreamed about serving or serving alongside of. And so it's made it more interesting in being open, and that openness to follow where God is leading. But it just takes, I didn't get professionally, I studied to be a teacher, which has nothing to do with anti-trafficking movements. In theory,
funny though, how it's nothing is ever wasted in God's economy too.
Yeah.
And it's all connected. So thank you for sharing that prayer too, because I love Thomas Merton, New Seeds of Contemplation, kind of a life-changing book. So yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I think my wife who heads up a nonprofit, I think she has the same prayer posted by her desk as well. I'm just curious.
Yeah.
I mean, in the bio, we talked about you've worked since 2005 to support some of this work, but then in 2018, it seems you became the CEO of LUV, or Lift Up the Vulnerable. So can you kind of take us on the journey from 05 to 2018 to the present, kind of?
Yeah. So in 2005, our organization was invited to go, and I'll take 2 steps back. In 2003, when I was still living in Europe, is when we learned about human trafficking. And I was serving as a volunteer, a board member for a new organization that wanted to care for orphans and widows. And we were spending a summer in Portugal and helping rehabilitate construction-wise a children's home. And it's during that time that we were there that we learned that the kids were being exploited and being used for pornography, prostitution, and that was heartbreaking enough. But then it took years to close down the home. So we knew that the kids were living in that situation without kind of legal recourse that we could take to protect them, that the arc of justice was very slow for them. And so it sort of informed, not just sort of, but that informed our vision mission to be a part of preventing human trafficking and standing with kids that were vulnerable before they would be exploited. And so we were exploring what did that mean. In 2003, human trafficking wasn't really being talked about. And so we had to do work to understand the nuances of it, where it was taking place, where were people most vulnerable, where were organizations doing good work. And most of the world didn't even know about those 2 words, though we knew, oppression and exploitation have always been around. It's not something new, but those 2 words coming together and a shift in mindset for how it was operating in this world really informed how we would move about. So an organizational partner invited the founder of our organization to go to South Sudan in 2005 on a trip with other ministry leaders to see the situation. It was at the height of the Darfur conflict, and there was just lots of violence. Villages were being raided, and whole entire villages were being trafficked. So the kind of MO of the at that time it was the Janjaweed, which is now called the Rapid Support Forces, and is involved in some of the violence that's still taking place in Sudan today. They would raid villages, kill men, and take women and children into slavery. And they would take them in mass. The kids and women had to walk, or some rode on horseback. So, just extreme violence and horror and terror that they were perpetrating on the people. So we were a part of kind of exploring what was God doing in the midst of this, because God always has a remnant of people that are there, that are doing God's will, to grow compassion, to stand up for justice. And that's when we've met our first kind of local director that was South Sudanese, that was protecting with the resources he had, kids in his village. And from him, we helped grow a community and network that led us to today, where we have now 3 centers. And that's a very broad stroke, but that I'll pause to let you ask some questions about that.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for painting the picture. And I think too, something I would love for you to share is just how it all got started. I mean, you've shared kind of the history and the context, but I remember you shared with me a little bit about the founder and how he was kind of a person with right in the middle of that with lived experience,
Yeah.
and how this all culminated.
Yeah, so one of the founding leaders of the work that we do is called James Luwalatok, and he is from the border of Darfur region of South Sudan. And when he was a child, his village was also raided, because Sudan and South Sudan have been at war for over 5 decades. So this has been an ongoing chaos-making problem on the continent of Africa it's the longest running civil war or conflict region on the African continent. And so when James was just a boy, his village was raided, and he walked with other lost boys. If you're familiar with the story of the Lost Boys, yeah, and Lost Girls of Sudan, they walked across South Sudan to Ethiopia. And South Sudan, Sudan, when it was one nation at the time, it was 3 times the size of Texas. So it's it was the largest country on the continent. And to imagine from ages 5 to whatever, however old, walking long distances for freedom, for respite, without water, without food, just finding things as you went. With some of there are stories, there's many stories that have come out from the Lost Boys that, kids were taken by lions. If there were stragglers, they would be eaten by lions or hyenas. And so they just had to, in the very basest way, they had to survive. And he was one of them. And so he has a lot of lived experience of what the kids that we currently serve have endured, as do all of our leaders. When he got to Ethiopia, months later, war broke out in Ethiopia, and they had to flee again. And so there was just no land that would welcome them, as a felt sense. There was no place for them. And it was during that kind of last battle time that he was conscripted as a child soldier. And so 11 years old, 10 years old, he was fighting in the Sudan-South Sudan war. He was carrying an AK-47. He was being trained and raised up by other child soldiers. He saw kids that were his age or around his age that were being killed in battle. And he had to live with that experience. Wow. He was eventually set free. And then found his way to Kenya, which at that time there are still large refugee camps there, but at that time there was massive amount of Sudanese people that were coming to Kenya. He got, mentored and supported, got resources. Living as a refugee is no easy thing, but he, made his way in the refugee journey too. And he was on a list to be able to get a visa to come to America and get a green card to come to America. And he received it, But several weeks before his journey to fly to the United States, he had a vision. And God, in his vision, God told him that he should not go to the United States, but he should return to the war zone and stand for kids just like him. And he did it. He handed back. People told him he was crazy. He didn't have any resources. He didn't have any ministry support. He sold the clothes on his back, and he found his way. It's hard to get back into a war zone without resources too, but he found his way back to his village, and he started gathering kids one by one and offering what he could. And that's when we found him.
Isn't that incredible, Mark?
Mm.
Like, I just think about the journey that he made and the just the trauma of being of what he experienced and just like you were mentioning, just I think unimaginably so, like things that we just maybe don't even think about and haven't had to walk through even in our country, like dealing with like lions and then being conscripted as a child soldier. And that's another thing that trafficking expands to encompass is labor trafficking and being a child soldier and these other ways we don't always see it as much in the States. Certainly we have labor trafficking, right? But just the trauma that a soldier has, like, and seeing enough as an adult, you're seeing other, we're seeing that those are long-term PTSD effects, right? And then as an adult, but think of as a child in your formative years. Yeah. Formative years. I wanted to say formulative. That wasn't the right word, but as a young person, as an adolescent, you're just so young and seeing those things, and then to choose not to give into that fear, to choose to go back. And try and want to give what you can and just to trust, to trust God and to trust that there was a path forward. Like that is one of the most inspiring stories I think I've ever heard. So thank you for sharing.
When you talked about South Sudan and 50 years of war, I mean, we've done some work in Liberia, West Africa, and they've had war. I mean, it was kind of two different stretches, but yeah, 89 to 2003, and it was kind of 89 to 97, and then like 99. So can you just real briefly, but like, wow, I mean, we have wars that maybe last 4 years, something like 50 years. And what is the status of it today?
Yeah. So South Sudan, or Sudan, was colonized by Great Britain. And in the 50s, 60s, I believe it was just before 1960, it was kind of a shared governance between Egypt and Great Britain, and they were overseeing and colonizing the nation. There were a lot of Arab colonization up in the north, and in the south there was more Christian missionary influence. And so eventually it became an ideology war. In part, there's a lot of, this is broad strokes, but there was a war in the north there was an Islamization that was taking place in the north, Sharia law that was being enacted. And in the south, there was a pushing back of that because they wanted their freedom. They were local, they were indigenous to the country, and they wanted to govern and be a part of decision-making for their own benefit. And so this war and clash started to take place, also driven by resources. Eventually it was discovered that oil and gasoline, not gasoline, but oil, and it was a resource-rich region, gold, lots of resources in South Sudan. But so at a local, global kind of geopolitics level, there has just been years and years of exploitation of the people, and conflict has been perpetuated by outside players, including Russia, China, United Emirates, lots of different entities that benefit when places that are resource rich are in chaos, because they can mine the resources without much governance or an oversight. So the wars have had different stages. There have been some times where there has been peace or relative peace. 2005, there was a peace agreement signed between the North and the South, and they set a place for a 9-year kind of pause while they just decided and determined that South Sudan would govern itself, and became its own independent nation in 2011. But even during that time, Sudan was propagating violence against the Darfuris. And so, there's a lot of things going on. And I'm probably not doing justice to it at all. Sorry, historians.
Even since they became an independent nation in 2011, there still is conflict.
Then they imploded.
Yeah.
Yeah. So South Sudan imploded, and the governing leaders were from different tribes, and they started fighting against each other. But it must be marked that the two leaders, they also were profiteering from the war. There's lots of reports for how they were, their families in Kenya were living just down the road from each other while they were profiteering from the war that they were perpetrating.
Oh, no.
So in Sudan, war broke out again in last April in 2023. And that is the current kind of crisis that's happening right now. And over 10 million people, or close to 10 million people, have been displaced from their homes. And famine is starting to grow. I saw a report yesterday from the World Food Program that half of the population, which is about 26 million people, are food insecure. Half of a country's population, because they've already been hard pressed even before war broke out. And now with the chaos of war and the movement of people, they can't plant, they can't harvest. It's just, and aid groups aren't coming in as regularly because it's hard to get them resources. And the world is currently stretched very thin with lots of different chaoses and lots of need out there. And so Sudan is being overlooked in a lot of different ways. And we don't, our news cycle in the United States has always not been great for global news, but you never hear about Sudan, or very rarely.
I have to say NPR does a better job. And if you even want to, like, the BBC does better too.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, no, this was actually really helpful to have this context and incredible vulnerability. I mean, it's like unimaginable. And just to think about profiteering off of war. I mean, I know that that's probably very common, but it's just so sickening to really think about, like, you're putting your country through what you're putting your country through, and the famine that is subsequently following that, and just like how devastating. And then you're also taking the children and you're selling them to be a soldier, or you're selling them for sex. Like, I think we're painting a picture a little bit of like just how needed I think your organization is, which I want to get into, like what you guys are doing. But yeah, so thank you for kind of sharing, I think, with us, because I think for myself, I'm definitely pretty ignorant, honestly. So I really appreciate that. And I hope our listeners too, that this is sort of opening your eyes a little bit.
It makes you want to dive in further. If I could, I think this will fit in, but I think I'm at your website, liftupthevulnerable.org, Audrey, and you make a strong claim here. Our model prevents trafficking and empowers children and women to thrive as change agents in their own lives and communities, with a threefold effort there of protection, education, and economic development. So I'd be interested to hear you talk about that.
Yeah. So because of the 5 decades of war, infrastructure is gone. When we first started working there in 2005, there was very few paved roads. So getting resources across rivers, the bridges weren't to speak of, they had to go, shipments of trucks had to go during the dry season when everything was dried up, which was also a problem time for people because there wasn't water, there wasn't access to food. So there's been no schooling by and large. There's no medical infrastructure. So it's more, before even the war in Sudan, 70% of kids in South Sudan that were school age didn't have access to education. So kids are not being invested in because no one's being invested in. It's very much just survival and survivalism that is at the forefront. But everyone is struggling to get food. There's massive food insecurities even before the war. People were living on $1.90 a day, so or less. So it's just the need is so great. And because of the need being so great, and at a very baseline level, people not having access to things that would help in their own life and livelihood, thriving is another stage, but that doesn't come until kind of your basic needs are met. So it's very common for girls to be sold as child brides for lots of different reasons. There's a dowry involved. And so families that have daughters receive income for those daughters. Often it's cattle, but cattle is wealth especially in most of these communities. So there was girls were being commodified, are still being commodified. It's not a done deal, but girls are being commodified. It's also helps boost up the families that they're coming from because they have one less mouth to feed. So there's child brides is a big issue. Child labor is a really big issue. And so all of these things, and of course, sexual exploitation is always going to be prevalent, but all of these things kind of pinpointed the need for us going and serving in Sudan, South Sudan, because our mission was to go where children and women were the most vulnerable, but where there was little to no other help available because it was either too expensive or too dangerous or too remote for most people, most organizations to go. And so we wanted to stand with the remnant, like we were naming before, the people that were there that were still, wanting to be faithful to God and wanting to care for the most vulnerable children, the widows and orphans in their distress in their communities. When we found James, he helped us grow a vision for what that looked like. What does addressing the root causes of exploitation look like, and how do we live that out? And it shifts. We started in 2005, and now it's a little bit different in 2024 because there has been some advancements. But when we first started, we knew protection was kind of a pivotal part, and protecting children. Many of them didn't have anywhere to go for help. Many of them were sleeping in trees at night just to avoid hyena attack. So it's our mission is prevention of trafficking, but also caring for those who are oppressed. So in war-torn countries, oppression may not lead to human trafficking, but oppression is oppression is oppression. And we want to bind up the brokenhearted. We want to be there for people that are really suffering. And so, and help and equip and enable them to create a trajectory or a motion of compassion growing. And that's where the change maker kind of concept comes in, that James was transformed. He wanted to transform other kids. Now those kids are alumni from our programs and they're living it out in different ways. So how do we grow movements of transformation, which is living out the faith? How do we grow that in really hard to reach places? And that's how we started with that vision of this is going to take time, because it took time to destroy the place. But we're seeing the fruit slowly, one life at a time. We're seeing the fruit through these models of protection. So that's kind of giving them nutrition, giving kids that don't have access to nutrition, housing if they need it, resources like clothing. Then education is the next level. So investing in them, providing also safe places for kids that do have family and do have a place to live. But, school can be a safe place for kids to begin to access, what God is calling them to. So if they have the opportunity for schooling, where they do get food from our foods programs. So that's kind of a built-in component because we know it's critical. So kids that come to our school that live elsewhere, they're being empowered and equipped to grow into who God is calling them to be. And then the economic development aspect is both for community members, because there's massive joblessness. There's not a lot of economy in these communities. We're say very remote villages, so there's not a lot of economy. So we're providing jobs. Last year, I believe there's over 200 local leaders that we were able to employ, and they're pouring forth into the kids that they know and the families that they know and the communities that they know. They're seeing that transformation. And but it also means economic development to us also means scholarships for students that come through our program getting them scholarships so that they have trade or university degrees so that they can then grow in their vocational journeys.
Mm. It's so exciting because I feel like there's so much wisdom in employing and empowering leaders within the community and not just kind of coming in and saying, oh, we know what you need. It's like from the inside. And I think you had shared this too on our previous conversation, but it's also a smart way to do it because right, I feel like it's because, as you said, there is a difficulty in accessing these areas in these communities. And so really by empowering these leaders from inside it, there's probably a less of a likelihood that you're going to be like, oh, you guys got to get out of here, like for governmental, yeah, for there to be someone coming in and saying like you guys got to get out of here. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in that too.
Yeah, or especially early on, the president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, who is now indicted on war crimes by the ICC, he's in prison, but his kind of reign still remains. But he would often kick out nonprofits or NGOs, humanitarians, because they would be reporting on the oppression or the atrocities or the genocides, depending on what was happening that was going on. So he would kick out foreigners, internationals, and therefore work would end because everyone had to flee. But so our model kind of incorporate for lots of different reasons, including that the people know what the people need. What is critical in communities. Where me moving to South Sudan, it would take me a lifetime plus to figure out like the things that because you're born in it. So it was a part of our model in equipping local leaders because it just made sense. The work could continue, like you named.
The idea of a person who's been transformed, like James, going back and trying to teach and share and help others be transformed. It's 2 Timothy 2:2 from the Bible, from the New Testament, right? Paul says those things you've heard from me and seen in me, share it with others that'll share it with others. And so that's the way to see things multiply.
So there's a young man named Peter Mangar, and his parents were killed during the war. And so his older sister, who was 10, became responsible for him. And he said he was about 3 at the time, but he might have, there's no birth certificates. So between 3 and 5 is probably his age range when that took place. So a 10-year-old is responsible for caring for a 3 to 5-year-old, which is not uncommon in lots of places around the world. But just incomprehensible also. There wasn't any food for them to eat. She was starting to work at 10, 11, 12 and as a servant in a local household. And Peter was begging for food in the local market. And he would get beaten a lot because he was dirty. He was, kids as beggars aren't welcomed. And it was the same year that James was heading back to South Sudan. And when James oversaw him getting beaten in the market, and he intercepted and saying, what's going on? Why are you hurting this child? And the person that was beating him said, he's a thief, 3 or 5-year-old, a thief. And it's just he's a bad kid. So James bought him a plate of food. He remembers this. Peter reports this. James bought him a plate of food and asked him questions about his life. And Peter eventually became one of the first students in our school. He eventually became one of the first boys in the boys' dormitory that we have. So we have girls housing and boys housing because girls and boys are both exploited in South Sudan. And it's almost 50-50, where we have about 50% girls in our program and 50% boys. But Peter was one of the very first to be welcomed into the boys' dorm. He was one of the very first to graduate from high school in 2016, and one of the very first to go to university. He got a degree in public health. And last year, he came back and is now in a leadership role at the center that James leads. He's actually the deputy director, where James is the director. And so the very little is now his successor in many ways. That if something were to happen to James, he would be the one that would help take the lead of the
Wow.
organization. So, and that's just one story. We have a lot of different stories of how that's living it out. So now
Beautiful.
Peter is helping to invest in the next generation of kids that are in school program, and pay it forward. An agape movement of pay it forward, which I think is what we're called to.
I'm not, I feel like I'm a little bit struck by also their names, like the apostle
Yeah,
names.
sure.
I love that so much. And Peter, I will build my church upon you, the rock, right? And I love that. We're really seeing that true mentorship, discipleship, and like what you are doing is really effective. And this is the result. And that's really an inspiring story. And I really feel like if people are, I would love if you could, like, when people give to you and when people support you, which I'd love for you to kind of talk about that financial model and kind of how you do that. But could you break down, like, so if somebody gives $100, for instance, like what could that help to cover? Just because I feel like sometimes that can be helpful for people to see how that translates.
Yeah. So, to protect a child for a whole year, and that's offering them the housing, education, food, resources, clothing, all the things. It costs about $2,500, one child, 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
So that's about $200 or so a month, to give a child everything that they need, to grow and thrive, which is just incomprehensible if you have children in the United States, or even just go to Target for one day.
Right, right.
We can drop that pretty easy, knowing that. But to know that that's the transformation that takes place. A gift of $25 will feed a child for a whole month, 3 meals a day. And so when we invite people to give, and thinking of that, it costs over $25 to eat out one meal for us, for just, if you go out to eat. So, but you can, if you gave generously to help, provide food for people in very food insecure regions, it would feed them for the whole month. So, yeah, we really look to be very lean in our work, but we're employing local leaders. We're helping to create systems of economy in these local communities where things are becoming different. One of the economic development programs that we do offer too is agriculture. So we're investing more and more in agriculture school farms to help our partners to be on a path towards self-sustainability. Currently, LUV provides 100% of the funding for all 3 of our centers. So we have a center along the border of Darfur, one along the border of Uganda, and one in the Nuba Mountains of Sudan. And we have about 1,400 students in all 3 of those, so collectively, and about 600 or so in housing. So our school program is really our largest program that we're investing in, because we want more and more people to have access to the resources, even if they, living at home is always best if you have a safe home to live in. But for kids that just don't have anywhere to go, they come and live with us. So, our model then, with this school farming is to help offset some of the dependency that they have on foreign aid, because we currently have to import all food. We do it from Kenya, or some places from Sudan, but we have to import food to these places, which is very costly, and it's also just it has a lot of downsides. So if they can be growing their own food, that's our aim. And it creates economy for especially local farmers who may not have had access to education. So our largest farm last year, they were harvesting on about, I think, 120 acres. They were employing about 30 local women who are learning the skills and technical kind of training for how to do farming smart, and with more efficiency. And then they were also equipped to have their own farm plot at their homestead, so that they could generate food for their families in addition to the income that they were getting. But that 127 acre farm, for the first year last year, grew 75% of the food that the kids were consuming.
Hmm.
So we're on a path towards slowly getting, helping them flourish in that way. That's our first step goal of
Very
food
cool.
security. And so that helps, that helps strengthen the diet diversity of our students. It also helps them see the spectrum of how things grow and go from seed to your table,
Yeah,
which is
cool.
more of a foreign concept to us, but important one for all of us to learn about. So food security is kind of a component of what we're doing to help strengthen communities and lives. And we do that one in particular with Rise Against Hunger. We have an organizational partner that helps support that effort.
Oh, so Audrey, you live in Tennessee, is that right?
I live in Alabama.
Alabama. I'm
Oh,
sorry. I
I
thought
think
it
I
was
said
Tennessee. All right.
that.
Yeah.
My bad.
All right, Alabama. But and then you've had how many? Many trips to Sudan and South Sudan. Is that right? Or
Yeah, for a lot. I get my visas. They take up a big chunk of your passport.
Yeah,
and
sure.
such different worlds. Again, referencing my work, my wife's work in Liberia, West Africa. But I mean, is that like culture shock? I'm just the back and forth. It's so different. When I landed in Liberia the first time, I'm like, same planet, different world.
Yeah.
And came back all 6 trips, and it's like just the word desperate. And then I'm just curious. And then B is, how do you go about trying to? There's a song from Keith Green back in the day. Michael Carr did a remake. I sound old right now, but I mean,
I love Keith Green.
Asleep in the Light. And I just feel like that's the American church in America. And how do you wake up? Because, there's so many resources here, and, every ministry could and should be staffed, but we've got more storage units being built than anything these days. So.
Ooh.
Yeah. I remember the first time I came back from South Sudan walking down the cereal aisle. It was pretty intimidating.
Crazy. No, you're right. So many choices,
For
right?
sure.
Yeah, so many choices. Yeah, when I first went to South Sudan in 2006, and it was a big faith journey for me because it was active war, and I really had to, walk closely with my God in order to make the decision to go even. And I felt, when I made the decision, I felt a peace about doing it. And I knew that, no matter where I was, if I was taking that small step, my desire was to please God. And so if that was it, then that's what I wanted to do. And that's how I felt God was leading me. But it was so different. And it's very, even though things have shifted for sure, there's no electricity, there's no running water. When we go, we stay in tents. This is in the remote villages. I think if you go to Juba or, back in the day, Khartoum, the capitals, they are now different. But I have not experienced luxurious life in South Sudan. So you do bucket baths, and for these aren't necessarily hardships, but it makes life really difficult. And we do it for a week or 2 weeks.
It's not the American way, though. I'll tell you that.
It's not the American way.
Running water. That's running water. One thing of that is what we have on the daily basis.
Right. No, we won the lottery here.
Yeah.
But how do you communicate that to people? I mean, you don't put them on a guilt trip, and you're trying to. How have you, or how are you communicating that to?
I feel like it's just the facts. Like I think it's kind of sobering just to hear.
But, we compete against all the other nonprofits that are crying out too. So.
Yeah. So I have found, I can't convince anyone to do anything.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
But I can just invite, invite people. And even in my own journey of awakening, there's more going on than we make space for in both the spiritual realm and the physical realm. Like there's just more going on. And as you learn more about human trafficking and the nuances, and then it's, I first learned about human trafficking through sex trafficking, and that really motivates people to take action. But then when you learn, it's your clothing too, and it's the food that you eat, that none of us escape the grips of human trafficking because it is so pervasive in our world. It is an everybody problem, and it needs an everybody solution. And so I don't try to convince. I just try to name this is an opportunity for each of us to take one more small step, and one more step in a journey to help alleviate the oppression that people are feeling. But we're all needed. We're all needed. And if you just take one small step, will you take another, and grow in your journey? That's how I find, for me at least, that's how, when I'm learning something, I just take one small step at a time, one small step at a time.
That's very
and
good. That's very
it unfolds.
Yeah, because I think it can be overwhelming, like all the causes and all the, but I also think it's like the worst thing would be to look away. We quote William Wilberforce a lot. It's like, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you didn't know. And so, taking that knowledge, and like you're saying, it's what does that step look like? And for some of us, it could be, hey, I want to work for Lift Up the Vulnerable. I want to go to these places, or I want to help financially support these leaders. Like, I'm already thinking, what can I do in my budget, like to help support? Because really the impact, even like you were kind of breaking it down, what $25 can do for a child. And that's like 3 coffees, or like, you know what I mean? It's like, we don't need that. And we're so privileged. And I think we need to kind of look at that. We don't want to look away from that, because that would be the worst thing. But also, don't get overwhelmed either. Find the thing that you can do. And I was just going to ask too, because I think, I'd love for you to share, like, so how many centers do you have? Like you mentioned, is it 3 that you said?
That's right. Yes.
Sudan.
So we have 3 centers. They're in very different locations, from different tribes that are working in those locations. And what's kind of the unique, special ingredient of the work that we do is the leadership must be from those villages, because they know how to navigate the local leadership things.
Right.
Because each one's really different. So James couldn't be the director at another center, even though he's really effective in Bahr el Ghazal, northern Bahr el Ghazal. He would not be as effective in Eastern Equatoria, because of lots of different reasons. So in the same way, that's why I'm not from Alabama, but I claim it now. Alabama, can't go to Eastern Equatoria and think I can figure it out.
Right.
So
those communities
it's the communities. It's a community model.
I guess too, I think the reason I kind of wanted to specify too was, I love this model. Is this something that other people are wanting to replicate? There's a fly in here. I'm so sorry. It's like driving us nuts. But it's
first world problem.
It is a first world problem. Mark, bringing me back. But no, absolutely it is. But absolutely, like, is this something that people could replicate, are replicating? Are you looking to replicate it anywhere else? I mean, obviously there's enough to do, like where you're at, but I just think it's so awesome. And I think it would be serving other war-torn conflict zones really well. I mean, it sounds like. So I'm just curious what you think about that.
Yeah, when people work with local leadership, and not just work with, but learn from, and equip, and we have a co-leadership model that they really inform the decisions we make. They inform our budget. They inform, what our next step in growth is. And we help support and pour into, like, introducing them to new models, or introducing them to new things that exist in this world. Unfortunately, we do policies and procedures. We're the policy and procedure police.
Right.
But they're living out how to engage in the communities that they're at work in, and that's critical. It's also really, really hard, and that's why people don't do it. That's why organizations don't do it, because it's relational. And when you're driven by numbers, or when you're driven by impacts, those things are important, but it's the slower steps of relationship building that really make this work effective. It's just harder. It's really hard, because as all relationships are.
Yeah.
All real relationships are really hard.
Yeah, it's not, it is tangible, and it is like measurable, quantitative, but you're right. I don't think it can be said enough. Like you said, it took time to destroy. And sometimes it actually takes more time to build up, but actually too, the multiplication effect of empowering one leader, like you're seeing that, you're seeing the stories of how this is multiplying and how this is growing. So I do feel like, yeah, if other people, I don't know, I think join with what you're doing, learn from that. But again, I think this should be replicated. I don't know if anyone's going to do it, but I think they should. I think there's a lot of wisdom.
It's the talked about thing in the NGO space. Like, yeah, we want to do this. Like, it's good to do, but doing it in the practicality of that is what is, I think, harder, especially if an organization is large and it's hard to pivot. So we started with this from the beginning as part of our DNA, and therefore it could only, it's just grown stronger. And part of the work is we didn't like build a whole infrastructure all at once. It was a slowly investing and growing in relationship and growing in trust with one another, because you're thousands of miles away. So doing that slow investment is how it came to be what it is today.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us, Audrey. This has been so eye-opening and a bit sobering, and I hope listeners can kind of feel that tug a little bit and really join with you in what you're doing. Lastly, how can people do that? What is the best way?
Yeah, so I appreciate that liftupthevulnerable.org was named earlier. So it's liftupthevulnerable.org.
All right.
Go to visit us.
Yes, love for short.
Yeah, so, learn more. Come and visit our website, sign up for our emails, learn more about the work that we're doing. We believe that taking local action will make a global impact. And so there's lots of different opportunities for that, including giving. So you can make a one-time gift, or we have a monthly giving program like most nonprofits. But one thing that's coming up in the fall, when you join the monthly giving program, you help us address the root causes of exploitation and uplift these local leaders who are leading the way for transformation. So it's really making tremendous impacts. And one of the ways that we engage with our monthly givers is invite them to interact with those leaders. And so this fall, we're going to have a special alumni meeting where people can come and hear from Peter and some of the teaching staff that used to be students there, but now are teachers or working in the clinic. So we're going to have a really interesting kind of conversation with them to hear their expertise and insights from their journey, lived a full spectrum journey of being both recipient and participant in transformation and what God has been doing. So those are quick ways to get involved and really critical.
It's interesting. We're recording this on Thursday, July 18th, and I'm not sure when Kat will release it to the world.
Probably
but
next Tuesday.
On this Saturday, July 20th, the U.S. Olympic men's basketball team is playing South Sudan. Did you know that?
I didn't know that, actually.
Yeah,
that's
so
awesome.
Anyhow, that's interesting. And now you've got 2 days
fun sports
to get a hold of the media and say, you need to run PSAs about our organization.
Oh, there you go. Adjacent opportunity.
That seems like a huge mismatch, but that is what's on the schedule. So
that's cool. That's really cool.
This is certainly something to celebrate.
Yeah. One of the things that we're doing from this summer and into the new year, or not into the new year, but into the fall, is something called Love Strong, where we're inviting people to participate through growing healthier themselves, but participate in strengthening the children, especially in Sudan, because of the food insecurity issues that are so significant there, with half of the population not having access to food. We want people to join us in raising awareness and taking kind of practical steps to raise resources through peer-to-peer fundraising, that they can really make a tangible impact in improving the lives and addressing that root cause of food insecurity, which really then amplifies and spills over into other vulnerability points if that's not cared for. So people can go to our website and look for Love Strong.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. So thank you so much, Audrey. I am excited for people to hear what you have to say and to just again, this to light a fire for them. It certainly is for me. And really appreciate your heart and the work that you're doing. Thank you so much for coming and sharing about it.
Yeah, it's my honor. Thank you both.
Thanks, Audrey.
Okay.